Good day, everyone. Welcome to the Inverted Orthodoxy podcast. I am Blake, and I got Kyle and Doug with me. We're three pastors trying to answer your questions as you send them in, and we want to take you on twists and turns and all sorts of things and probably provide more questions by the time we're done talking. But welcome, everybody, and yeah, we get to jump right in today with questions.
Before we jump in, I just had this moment of just realization. For the people who are watching. Now, I realize the vast majority of our audience is audio only.
Yeah.
But for the people who are watching, it's just a beautiful reminder of the volatile weather in Alberta. Because last week, I'm pretty sure we were all sitting here in shorts and a t-shirt.
I was in by accident because I had thrown my pants in the wash. If you don't remember, I acknowledged that. I really wanted to wear pants, but I couldn't.
But we were all wearing shorts and a t-shirt.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you're wearing a sweater, you're wearing a long sleeve shirt, and I'm wearing a jean jacket.
Yep.
Because
And I just doubled up my shirt before I came downstairs.
But it was just all of a sudden this indication of, wow, if somebody tuned in, they're going to be like, is this the next episode from last week? But next week, we may be back in shorts.
Shattering the illusion of timelessness here.
It could be anything.
So, sorry. I just had this really surreal moment.
No, that's cool.
That's awesome.
Right on. We're jumping in. Last week, we got a question about just our experiences and things going on in our life.
Yep.
And we're following this trend. So this next one is a good one. What was your earliest experience of God, and who is the first person who created a memory of God for you?
All right. Do you want me to go first?
Sure.
So I feel like I need to differentiate what is my earliest experience of God, what is my earliest memory of God.
I think the question is acknowledging that.
So, okay, well, I would just say, and I don't remember this, but my mom, so when I was born, before I hit 7 or 8, my parents were going to the Catholic Church on occasion because my dad had been raised Catholic. And so my mom would occasionally take us to Mass. Yep. And I was apparently between 1 and 2 years of age. My mom was at Mass, and I was crawling around under the pews, and I popped my head out, and a very loud voice said something along the lines of, "Mom, I saw an angel under here," which she was like, she's told me the story.
Yeah.
And she watches the podcast. So if I'm getting this wrong, Mom, you can correct me. And then be on AER next week. But it was something to that effect.
Right.
And everyone laughed, and she was embarrassed. But she's like, I think something happened under there. Like she believed that.
Yeah.
But my earliest memory would be sometime after grade 3 is what I can remember. So we lived in Kingsville, and there was a road near our road that no houses had been built on, but there was just giant trees that kind of stretched over the road. It was not Alberta where there's no trees, so there were just trees.
Yep.
And I remember riding my bike down that road, looking up at the sky and seeing the sun kind of going through the tree, and just having this moment of knowing God was with me. A very, very real moment of God with me. That I've oftentimes during the seasons of life where I'm struggling and where I'm questioning and where I'm pondering things, I hold to that moment as a very real moment in my life, that I'm like, whatever else happens in my life, I cannot deny the reality of that moment.
Yeah. Earliest one I can think of would have been probably 9 or 10 years old experience of God. My brothers and I, we were at somebody from the church's house, and the adults were all hanging out, and the kids were playing in their backyard, also Ontario. So there's like a little patch where they'd cut off the trees where you could have property, and the rest was just forest.
We're making everybody want to move to Ontario.
Yeah, you went into the forest and we were playing, and my now infamous sense of direction was started early. Me and my brothers got lost in the forest behind these people's houses and couldn't find our way back. And I just remember, like, okay, we need to pray. And we just stop and pray once in a while. We must have been lost for over an hour. And we had no idea how to turn around. And it was just kind of like, stop. And we shift directions based on like 3 little kids praying. What are we going to do? And eventually we walked out of the forest onto a road as my parents, who were panicking now at this moment, are driving around the area on every road they can to see if they can find us. And we walked right out to where they were driving. And I was probably the earliest memory I can think of experiencing God and Him at work. I still look back to that day of maybe it's happenstance, but for the timing, for
Yeah,
3 kids to find their way
absolutely.
out of the forest that way, I hold on to that one for sure.
I think of, with all of these stories we're going to tell, and I'd love to hear yours, but I think of in When Everything's on Fire, Brian Zahn quotes another person who says, in the future, the only Christians will be mystics.
Yep.
Because your faith is going to be built on some of these
Yep.
experiences that you have that can't be
Yep.
easily defined.
Totally.
Yeah, you didn't really say
You grew up in
Kyle.
Alberta, so you never got lost in a forest.
No, I never had a tree experience. I don't remember my first memory of God. Like I'm trying to think through all because it's just like you, Kyle, I guess just in church every week. Like so my parents read devotions to me, all the rest.
Yeah.
But I think experience would be one of two, and I don't remember which came first, like earlier than the other. There was a time when, for whatever reason, I made money by doing something. Like my parents didn't give me an allowance, but I must have earned money somehow, and it was probably like $2. And my mom said that I had to tithe on it, and that was distressing to me because I was like, I'm not giving my money away, right? I earned this, but I put my 20 cents in the offering at church that Sunday. But my parents were good about always trying to, like, it wasn't just for no reason. Like, you just don't do this because, but they took me to the scripture in Malachi, talked about God's blessing, talked about trusting God, and God would like provide. So that was all said to me.
Yeah.
And then a very short period of time later, like probably days, we were going on holidays, and my grandma gave me like $20, which was like huge compared to the 2 I had.
Yeah.
And I remember just looking at my mom because she was standing right there, and she was like, God provides.
Yeah.
And that was like, all right. And I have really not struggled with God providing financially for me any time in my life since then. Not that I don't do well, or that I do well financially all the time, because I don't, but I just have this feeling that God will provide. So like you're saying that God is with you, mine would be like that. The other one is I just used to have these feelings when I went to bed at night where like, I don't know how to explain it. I don't know if I've ever even told anybody this before, other than my mom again, but I just feel like everything went really far away from me, and I'd be like all alone. And then I told my mom, or tried to explain that to me, and she's just like, you need to pray, Blake. And I remember distinctly again having that warm feeling of like, I'm not alone. Like God is present with me. So those two experiences have definitely shaped me
Yeah.
since then. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
All right. Well, continuing on with this line
hang
of
on.
thinking.
Kyle, did you answer who is the first person who created a memory of God for you?
No, I didn't, and I'm having a hard time really discerning who that would be. Just like Blake, I was just constantly in church and saturated in church. So there's faces and names that pop into my mind, both family and outside of that. But I don't know who that would be. So hard to even remember. So I'll pass on that part.
Yeah. Probably my mom or dad. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I guess.
Outside of my parents, I think of one Sunday school teacher who we tormented mercilessly for years.
Yeah.
She was an absolute saint, and we were the worst kids in the history of the church.
Yeah.
And she just loved us
Yeah.
and prayed for us. And I didn't think about it then,
Yeah.
but looking back,
Yeah.
I think of that woman,
Yeah.
and then a number of years ago,
Yeah.
she actually came out to Airdrie,
Yeah.
and she got to see that I was now a pastor.
No way.
And it was such a huge blessing for her that all of that garbage that she put up with,
Yeah.
there was some fruit from it.
Yeah.
And so looking back, I think of her, and I think of how she loved us when we were terrible. Like it took time to see it. In the moment, I would have never said to her. I'd have been like, "Oh, she's just fun to make fun of and to pick on."
Yeah.
But I think looking back and reflecting on life, I'm like, there was a lot of grace given in a very Christ-like way, because you can give grace, but let people know you're giving grace that is not really gracious.
Yeah.
But
Totally.
she was just gracious and loving and kind.
Yeah.
So
I'll adjust the question a little bit now that you're sharing. The thing that's coming back to me, and I can't put a single person necessarily outside of mom and dad, and I think that to be an assumed one. And I shared a few weeks ago at a church in Kemptville, Ontario, where I preached that. Dad had pastored there for a number of years, and it was really cool getting to go back and preach. And I shared there, and I'll share again. Like, that is some of my most foundational convictions about God and church came from there, and watching that community more than any individual, like how they cared for one another, and we did life with one another there. So that would include, as well, not only my parents, but my mother and father-in-law, but lots of different faces in that community that were foundational in me believing God is at work amongst people. I know there's a few people that listen from Kemptville right now, so shout out again. But no, that would probably be the easiest or closest I can get to an answer of people. Yep.
I think it's a good reminder for all of us that people might not see Jesus in our actions right now, but that doesn't mean they might not at some point in their life.
Yep.
Oh yeah. There's all those mushy songs, right? Like, I can only imagine, and songs about like what it'd be like when we get to heaven. But there's one, and maybe it's even that song, because I don't know song language very well, that talk about like seeing people who like had influence, or sorry,
That was thank you for giving to the Lord, wasn't it?
yeah, maybe, yeah,
Totally.
Where you'll see these people, that put into your life, but you'll also see people that you've put into their life, like,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I do think that probably will happen, right? Like,
On the
very
total flip
cool.
side, do you remember the Lumber song?
No.
It was a Christian song, and I remember I was like, oh, this song. I had such problem with it. So it was the exact opposite of like thank you or I can only imagine, in that it was this person dies and they go to heaven, and they're seeing all these mansions, and then they get to where their building's going to be built, and there's like a couple of things, just enough material to build a shack, and they complain, and the chorus is, that's all the lumber, that's all the lumber, that's all the lumber you sent.
Yes, I totally remember that time.
I remember the first time I heard this song, and I was like, this is so problematic for me.
My. So if we're going there, it was Ray Boltz was the thank you one, right?
Yeah.
He also had some music video for one of his songs where it was like a father and son, and like it was looking down towards the end of the world when the government was going to go against Christianity. So this dad was going to jail for talking about Jesus, and like they would interrupt the music of this dad and son like before he's going into prison, like about how he was doing the right thing, and that scared me so much.
There is
Do you
a
remember that one?
generation of Christianity where fear was a real thing.
I don't know that there's
It's
one
not gone yet.
generation. I think there's been more generations than not.
We just use different tactics, but
you can't use the same fear stick. You need a new fear stick.
That
True
was the
enough,
one that
true enough.
petrified me as a child. I'm like, oh man, we're going to jail for our faith.
Well, for me, it wasn't a song when I was a kid. It was the not Left Behind,
Thief in the
Night movies.
Yeah, totally.
Man, yeah, those were. This has gone way off the
Yes,
rails
So
of
you need
a
to get your
wonderful
life right,
experience of
and you
God.
need to be
These are early
sending more lumber.
experiences, just not on the good side. Yeah.
Yes, that's exactly true. These were the negative ones as
These
well.
ones we need to take into counselors after the episode.
This podcast is fair and balanced, like Fox News.
All right. Well, this next question is kind of balanced that way. We've had our good experiences as kids, I guess for all of us. But another question: what experience or experiences in your life most shook your faith in God and His goodness? And what characteristic of God do you have the hardest time wrapping your head around? That's like two different
Yeah,
questions.
these are two very different questions.
Yeah. So let's start with the first one. What experience in your life most shook your faith in God and His goodness?
Kyle, you want to go first?
Sure. I don't know if we had many experiences, or at least that's not how I'm wired. So I think the biggest thing that really shook me, and I have talked a little bit about this on the podcast before, was coming to the point of seeing evolution as basically an indisputable matter in the way I came to understand it, and going, so what does this mean when I'd only been presented a 6-day version of creation? And so going, how am I supposed to hold these together? And it was either God or the Bible at that moment, or God in the Bible or not at all. It was there, and there's so many things that come down then the downstream of that, of like, how can I believe in God? How can I believe in His goodness? How and having to wrestle with that was probably one of the most shaking periods of time in my life.
I don't think you should undermine the reality of that crisis of faith that you went through.
No, I'm just
But I
trying
felt
to
like
make
you started by dismissing it.
It's not as much dismissing it as like I know for many people there are going to be groundbreaking experiences, and that's the question specifically asked for experience. And I would think to losses of loved ones or traumatic moments, and mine was less so a traumatic moment as much as just sitting into a learning and realization and going, all right, where do I go from here? And I'm not invalidating.
But I think it's still a valid experience.
Yeah, that's fair. I hear experience as like something happening to you more than me just having a crisis of faith and belief in my head more than in my experiences. All I'm trying to acknowledge there are different ones that other people have, but that one was probably the biggest one for me, and learning to navigate that, which became a years-long process, and became really fruitful and probably a foundational moment in my life and in my faith. But it was rocky ground for a while.
If I could just push back on that a little bit. I feel like you would have more grace to acknowledge the validity of that experience if someone was talking to you about their experience than you're giving yourself.
That's probably fair. Yeah, that's probably fair. And like I said, I just know there's so many people that went through. I had a very safe and secure and healthy childhood. Like I had my one grandma pass when I was 9 years old, but I was almost too young to really process it. And then until the last few years, like I didn't really have anybody close to in our lives die, and we were comfortable. We had what we needed. Like, so I just can't relate to that story that I know a lot of people have had to go through. So I'm just trying to recognize there's a difference in my experience to some. That's all. But yeah, fair.
I'll start mine by saying maybe fishing for questions a little bit here, but just an interesting thought. A few weeks ago, I met with a member of our church who just expressed to me in our general conversation, like talking about soul care and, like meditating on God and being aware of his presence, all those things, and also dealing with your own stuff.
Yeah.
But this person said that they didn't really believe that you could really even call yourself a real Christian unless you've been through some sort of crisis or faith or something that tested your faith. And I don't know if that's true, and we talked about that, but it definitely, when the person first said it, I was like, yeah, I think I could understand that, right? That, probably in a church context for sure, we present God as this loving being that, created the world, all these things, loves us enough, sent his son to die. And it's all about our belief and faith, right? That's kind of how most people first encounter God. And I think that can be a very real experience where you decide to have faith in something like that, right?
Yeah.
But then it's all just kind of this knowledge-based idea, right? That, well, maybe I believe that instead of something else.
Yeah.
Until there is something that does test your faith.
Yeah.
And then you have to really decide if you're in or not, right?
Yeah.
And I kind of would say that's kind of how I think of this question for myself.
Yep.
I think probably the biggest thing that, I don't know if it shook my faith, but caused me distress in my faith was acknowledging my own sinfulness, which sounds funny, but it's like, I'm a pretty confident person, and I think that's probably sinful in its own self, but I just always thought I had it going on as a kid, teenager, whatever, even in the church early on as a young adult, I was like, I do Christianity well.
Yep.
And at some point, I realized how.
Sorry,
you're my friend, so I think you know this. Like, it's not like this is a realization to you. You're this is my friend.
I would like you to just unpack that a little bit for our listeners, because I think that there may be people who are trying to understand what you mean by that, because we do all have a lot of baggage about what it means to be a Christian.
Yeah.
So just unpack that a little bit. I know your story, so just for our listeners.
Yeah, I grew up in a Christian home, very safe, encouraging environment. I don't remember a lot of stress, like relational conflict or anything. Like we were stable. We were good. And I saw it. I went to public schools and everything, so I saw non-Christians and how they behaved. By the time I got to high school, I realized that some people's parents weren't together. I saw people having things in life, and I just equated it to, well, I'm a Christian, so bad things don't happen to me, right? And then even I guess I presented leadership skills in our church when I was young and as a teenager. So I was running our youth group by the time I was like 19, 20 years old.
Yeah.
I got married young. I was kind of like the poster child for, they're going to have a great marriage.
Yeah.
And yeah, so those are the reasons why I thought, like, I'd see other people that maybe weren't doing even spiritual practices that I was. And that's why I thought I was good.
Yeah.
Like, I'm a good Christian. That's kind of
and
what
I just wanted, just so people got a sense of what you meant by that.
Yeah. I'm doing the things, right?
Yeah.
But then, as I got early into my marriage, I realized, man, I'm sinful. Like, sin is real, right? And I don't know that I had to struggle with that because as a kid, I became a Christian so young. It was more based on belief than surrender.
Yeah.
I guess that would be a good way to explain it.
That's a very good way to
So when it became a place of surrender for me, then I had to deal with my own morality and the fact that I am not good, right? And that if you give me time and space, I will choose to do things that are ungodly, right?
Yeah.
I really had to wrestle with that. And then wrestle with why God wouldn't just fix that.
Yeah.
Like, how come he just doesn't take my sinful desires away, right? He's a loving God. He should love me enough to do that, which caused me to spend a lot of years just developing my theology of suffering.
Yeah.
And that I see that way more in the Bible than I do God just giving people good, pleasing lives.
Yeah.
So, I think that was probably the first and most dramatic, shaking of faith or testing of faith for me.
If I could jump in before you do, Doug,
absolutely.
just to add in the concept you're talking about of like calling yourself a Christian on the other side of suffering or some kind of experience. Richard Rohr's book, Falling Up or Falling Upward? Falling Forward? I thought it was Falling Upward or Falling Up, something like that.
Yeah, you're right.
Either way, it's Falling something by Richard Rohr.
Falling Up. Falling Up.
That's very much what he talks about. And I don't think he would argue you're not a Christian until after that, but I get what the person's saying. But he says very much like any level of learning, like we understand the facts, A plus B equals C.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden in life, we all reach a point where it doesn't.
Right.
And we have to then process that. And he says some people try to just buckle down and ignore it. And we just are much more comfortable to stay with the A plus B equals C and then just pretend the rest of the world doesn't exist, or it crumples our faith, or we move through it into the second half of spiritual life is what he calls it. I loved the book. And I think
like
it,
brilliant. It's a brilliant book.
Second half would be a good way of
really good
describing
book.
it.
And so I would just, I think even just continue to be more charitable towards myself and how I shared and what you're sharing, that can be loss of loved one and like this shook my faith and my belief in goodness of God or belief. Either way, we spend the first half of our spiritual life building up these ideas and the second half recuperating from the fact that it doesn't always work out that way.
What I think he talks about in the second half, some of those ideas being deconstructed.
Yeah.
For
Right?
sure.
And that's part of what the second half is.
Yep.
And I think there is an element of it that brings us to the place where if we do it well by the end of our life, we're just holding to Jesus, not our theology. Because I think we don't realize that oftentimes we're holding more to our theology than to actually Jesus.
Yeah.
So, I agree. And I'm glad you brought that point back up because I do think to say someone's not a real Christian until they've been tested, I think undermines the validity of the people who haven't had to be tested yet.
Absolutely.
And I think wherever you are in your faith journey, I think you're supposed to be all in that place and embrace it and welcome it, be content with it, but at the same time recognize you're not going to stay there forever, but you're going to be called farther than it. And I think that is the idea. I was actually thinking about this the other day. That is the concept of a pilgrim's progress, right? That we get to a place where we're like, I've arrived. And that's a dangerous spot. It's a dangerous spot to say I haven't arrived anywhere, but it's also a dangerous spot to say I have arrived. So, but good stuff. For me, and we've talked about this before on the podcast, the experience that most shook my faith in God and his goodness was the death of my son. By far. I was like, is there anything else I could think about? Is there anything else that I could like put out there? And I've gone through other times and other seasons of life, but nothing compares to that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
All right. So what characteristic of God do you have the hardest time wrapping your head around?
This might sound like a cop-out answer, and I'm going to get beyond it. But to begin, I would say whichever one I'm thinking about deeply. Like I'm just being honest, but I think there's a lot of aspects of who God is and what God is that I just marvel at. And the older I get and the more time I spend thinking about them, the more I marvel at them. And I think that when theology is done right, it doesn't so much, the end goal is not so much giving us right thinking and proper answers. It's a proper awe of God.
Yeah.
That is what good theology does.
Yeah.
So
Very true.
I think about the love of God that never changes.
Yep.
Like that, you just think about that. Think about in your current state being the beloved of God. That boggles my mind. And I spend a lot of time reflecting on that. I think about the sufficiency of the work that Christ did. And I'm like, man, like that is just insane.
Yep.
And we don't even begin to comprehend that. And then I'll go on Instagram, and if you are ever on Instagram and you want to get something redeeming from Instagram, I would encourage you to follow Ken Tanner or Kenneth Tanner. Mm-hmm. We've shouted out to him before. I think his Instagram handle is Kenneth Tanner, but it could be Ken Tanner.
Yeah.
And he is a priest somewhere in Michigan, and he just talks a lot about Jesus, the God-man, and talking about the hypostatic union. And if you ever want to make your brain hurt, just do some reading on the hypostatic union. Yeah. The hypostatic union is Jesus was fully God and fully man. Yep. He wasn't limited in one of those. Yep. And I don't think you can really, honestly spend some time pondering the implications of that without your brain hurting.
Yeah. Fair. This is really cop-out answers. The one that frustrates
I gave one after the cop-out answer.
There's a tough part for two of them in my mind, and they are related. One, when I stop to think about it, is the unendingness of God's love. Not because it's not super easy for me to receive about myself. Yeah, Jesus loves me.
Right, of course.
But when I stop to think of how deeply he loves those people that I have a hard time loving, that's when that one becomes challenging. Or how he loves people throughout history or the world that I go, it's not even just that I have personal difference between them, but I look at people who have done horrible atrocities in human history. You know, how do you love them? That's a really hard one for me to get my mind around. And then I think both related, but also unrelated to that, is God's patience with humanity. And I just reread The Patient Fermented the Early Church, and like the conviction that God is going to be at work and he is going to make all things right. And so I have to trust his patience, and the fact that he's allowed humans to be a part of his process because he's patient with us. Like that one I don't get, because he's trusting me amongst other people and the whole world and the church. And I don't get that part of why you would do it that way. That they both bring level of frustration and inability for me to process them entirely. Those are probably the top two.
That's interesting, because my answer would be a combination of you both.
Sit on the fence some more, Blake. That's what you always do.
No, because when I read the question, and we've mentioned before, sometimes we read these questions ahead, sometimes we don't. I just sat down and read this question as I was sitting here on the podcast today, and right away I was like, God's patience. Yep. Like I don't know if I have trouble with it. For whatever reason, faith comes simple to me. Like there's not a whole lot I distrust God with, or I think, oh, that's not true. I'm able to attribute to God things that I think are godly and outside of humanity. Yep. Such as, just being outside of time. Like I think that's crazy, but I'm like, okay, that's God, right? Yep. Patience, though, I'm just like, oh man, like how is God patient with this world? Like it is. We've talked about the wickedness of this world, right? And it's not just like our generation; it's just like all the generations, right? Like it's just, it's crazy to me when I do soul care, and I see people, usually like a little bit older people or my age or older, that have walked with God for some period of time, and then disclose this thing that they've just never dealt with. And I'm like, how is God not just smacked you? Like, it's just like, and think of myself that way, right? I'm just like,
Totally.
It is amazing to me. And then when I read the Gospels, the reason it was combination is because I think of Jesus, his patience. I'm like, he is all God walking around. Like, it'd be one thing to be on a throne somewhere, you know, and just being like, oh, I guess the world is horrible. But he had to live with us.
Yeah.
And I just think, oh my word.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
how did he continue to just love people?
When I think of Jesus in that regard, though, I think more about his frustration with his disciples than the crowds.
Yeah, totally.
Absolutely. Like, people in general, like,
Maybe
you see
he
a
got
few
small
times
talk,
that
yeah.
Jesus, you know, he heals the 10 lepers and only one comes back.
Yeah.
And I think there's a moment where he's like, really?
Yeah.
but I read him and the disciples, and I read just and I find a lot of encouragement in the fact that disciples just never, ever are like getting it.
Yeah.
Right? And I'm like, Jesus would be like, I have spent months teaching you privately when I'm not standing in front of the crowds teaching them, which are the things we read in the Gospels.
Yeah.
But then he goes away, and I've taught you, and I've taught you, and I've taught you.
Well, and
Do you still not get it?
that hypostatic union,
Yeah.
like the most human I see Jesus in that. It just patience is when he says, how long must I put up with this wicked generation? Because I'm like, it almost sounds un-Christ-like, right? Like, it's just this moment of like,
Totally. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
yeah.
So,
Cool. All right. Well, continuing on. One of you might want to pull this up.
I got it.
Okay, I don't really understand Genesis chapter 21, verse 16. It makes Ishmael sound like he is still a baby, but he is actually a teenager and an adult in Jewish tradition, right? And why is there no water around? It just seems that they are both of an age where they could work or find berries or something. Are they destitute because this is God's plan?
So Genesis 21 begins with the birth of Isaac, and Abraham and Sarah finally have the long-awaited promised child. Abraham has already had Ishmael with Hagar earlier in the story, and yes, Ishmael is a teen at this point, and there is conflict between Hagar and Sarah, and Abraham sends Hagar and Ishmael away. And it says in verse 14, just to give a little context to the second part of the answer, she went on her way and wandered in the desert of Beersheba. Now, I don't know exactly where that is. I don't know all that's going on, but I think it's quite possible there were no berries and there was no water because she's in the desert. I do think that we don't understand the full context of the lack of rights that women had in that culture.
Yep.
And she wasn't even a married woman. Like, she's already a slave, and she's a slave woman, and now she's an abandoned and sent away slave woman. She is nobody. Like, she is literally nothing. And we can go, well, but look at the 10 Commandments, or look at the law, and look at how God tells, the people of Israel that they need to, not pick this edges of their fields and leave that for the foreigner and the alien and the widow.
Yep.
We don't realize that's hundreds of years after this story.
Yeah.
And Israel, at that point, God is giving them commands that are basically making Israel to be the social justice warriors of their day. Like, that is so far ahead and revolutionary compared to how the world operated. And so you can't start even with the context of the law to understand that. You have to go back up hundreds of years before that to the point where it's quite possible that Hagar, who's somebody who, it appears, comes out of Egypt with Abraham and Sarah as a slave that is given to them, and then is raped by her master because, her master's husband, because she says, use her for this, and then later on in life is discarded and thrown away. I think it's quite possible that she went to the desert because she was terrified if she saw another human being. She is just going to be, what other atrocity is someone going to commit to her?
Yeah, she's not walking around in the general public. Like, the question kind of alludes to this idea that they're adults. Why don't they make a decision to walk somewhere else besides the desert? She might not have thought she had any choice besides the desert.
And I think there could have been, because of all the trauma that she'd endured, a lot of fear to even go near other people. So it was with all of that that it says in verse 15, when the water in the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes. Verse 16, then she went off and sat down about a bow shot away, for she thought, I cannot watch the boy die. And as she sat there, she began to sob. So that's 21:16. I provide a little context. I gave the verse, and then I'll turn it over to one of you guys to share your first thoughts.
No, I don't feel like I have much more to add. You've hit the context of who Hagar is and her status impeccably well. That she was, probably a slave from Egypt and all those things, like her low status. And then I guess to only add to Ishmael, yes, he was probably a teenager, and according to Jewish law, an adult. But he's an adult with no status, with no property. He's a slave, so he has nothing to lean back on. Now, also, Israel's obviously not established at this point in the storyline, so they don't have their laws and their standards set up. So they are
Well, Israel doesn't exist.
Correct.
Yeah.
So they are a vagrant slave mom and slave child who have nowhere to go, no social infrastructure according to their story. So they at best are, yes, they could hope to get other work, but to be honest, they would have been treated probably like a runaway slave. Who's going to believe that they were cast out? They're going to assume that they ran away, and therefore they're just going to be either imprisoned, mistreated, and their situation may be just as bad in slavery. They may be alive, but it may be all sorts of torture and abuse ahead of them as well, that there's just an apathy that they have to be sitting with. And that is the beauty of this story, that God comes and meets them there, of they have absolutely nothing to live for or to offer anybody, and God meets them. And not only that, but allows Hagar to name him, which is really cool, but whole other story.
In the context when they ask about the boy being a child, because she puts the boy under a bush and is he a baby? I think it's important to recognize that a 12 to 15-year-old does not have the stamina or the strength of an adult.
Yep.
So it is quite possible that Ishmael has reached this point of being fainting or of close to fainting, or
he
just
could be
complete
worse off than
physical
she is.
exhaustion.
Yeah.
And I think probably is because he's not an adult.
Yeah.
Right? And so there's going to be a difference in strength between the two of them.
Yeah.
And we don't know exactly what it is, but I think you could take from this story, if you understand he's not a baby, because I've heard people who talk about, Ishmael's like 2, so she puts him, she's carrying him in a basket and she puts him under. No, he's not. He is older, but he's not a full-grown man.
Yeah.
He's still developing. So it's quite possible they're wandering in the desert and he's getting tired, and at some point she's like, he's got his arm around her and she's assisting him, and he's getting more and more tired and more faint, and she's also getting more and more tired, and then maybe he collapses. And she reaches the point where she can no longer carry him, but he's in a worse state than she is.
Yeah.
And then in that, he's still whimpering, he's still crying because she goes a bow shot away because she don't want to hear him. Yeah. If he's full of energy and screaming, "Hey, Mom, why'd you leave me here?" she's going to have to go a lot further than that away.
Yeah.
But if he is in this state of moaning and of groaning, of just pain and dehydration and exhaustion, you don't have to go far to get out of earshot of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think, we just talked about God's patience, or I just talked about God's patience. I think interesting, right? You're talking about the father of the, nation of Israel and all these things that, God is going to do through them. And he makes this judgment where he casts this lady out. Like that's not Jesus, right?
No.
In any way, right? So interesting story again. Those ones we have in the Bible that make us wrestle with, how much God loves us, accommodates us, and can restore and do awesome things through even our wickedness, right?
Yep.
So
Totally.
God is always working redemption.
yeah. We are out of time today. We're gonna wrap up and
Short one.
Get you guys next week. So we look forward to seeing you. Thanks
When
for
we're back in shorts.
yeah, totally. It'll be summer again.
Wednesday is projected to be 29. So,
Ugh.
but who knows what we're gonna wear down here in the freezing basement of this?
That's true.
I love the basement of this church. It's just beautiful.
Thanks for tuning in, everybody. That's another episode of Inverted Orthodoxy.
Send your questions in at invertedorthodoxy.com. Rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts.
You bet. We'll see y'all next time.